My pick is an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times by Michael Worraby, published a couple days ago. It's called "I Called for More Research on the COVID Lab Leak Theory. Here's what I found out." And he goes through how he's addressed this issue. He says, as a scientist who has contributed to several peer-reviewed studies that tell a very different story, I looked on with amazement at the growing divide between what the science shows and what much of the public and a minority of the intelligence community believe. But I've also watched with understanding for those who still suspect a lab leak, because I started there myself. And he talks about how early in the outbreak he thought, well, a lab leak is also possible, so let's look into it. And he began to look into it, and he ended up with finding that the Huanan seafood market was the early epicenter. A lovely paper that we have done here on TWIV, which he says is definitive. It shows that this is a zoonosis. But he says this is how science works. You have to, what did he call it? You have to kick the tires of a hypothesis to try and falsify it. I tabled all my other research to try and falsify the hypothesis that the pandemic began at one of the markets, and he could not falsify it. He said everything stood up. It's really beautifully written.
Not only did everything stand up, but everything he looked at to try to falsify it provided more evidence that it had in fact, and he found new things that people hadn't found before that underscored that this came from the market.
For me, this highlights a particularly annoying thing that I see in some of the columns on this, which is people will drag out the fact that early on some scientists entertained the lab leak hypothesis. Okay, and they'll say, see, these guys even thought it came from a laboratory. But that's how science works. You consider the hypothesis, and these same individuals over time convince themselves that it was not true. So it's totally disingenuous to bring that up as evidence for the lab leak hypothesis. That's evidence for science being done correctly, and the scientists figuring out that no, there's no evidence to support the lab leak thing. And even these guys, I think even Worraby says in this, show me the data, show me the data. You know, I'm not going to tell you it's not possible. No no good scientist will do that. Okay, but show me the data, dude.
So he closes it by saying, lab leak proponents cling to the contention that the presence of a lab that studies viruses and the emergence of a corona pandemic in the same city can't possibly be coincidental. But my colleagues and I showed in 2021 that this virus wasn't going to emerge just anywhere in China. It took a city. And, Wuhan and any number of other cities. And he writes, we should instead be asking, what's the chance that a big Chinese city like Wuhan would have a lab doing the kind of research that has come under suspicion? The answer is the vast majority of the biggest cities in China have labs involved in such research. If COVID had emerged in, say, Beijing, there would be no fewer than 4 such labs facing suspicion. I remain open to any and all evidence supporting a laboratory origin. So far, we have no such evidence.
I really like that analysis.
And I like that a lot. And I would just add, if this virus had emerged in New York or Boston or San Francisco or Chicago or Philadelphia or any other major American city, you'd be able to point to a lab probably and say, what are the odds? Well, that's where we put major research facilities.
Yet, the other day at the hearing, the former CDC director said this was made in a laboratory.
He's not a scientist, though. He's not a scientist.
But he's the former CDC director. He shouldn't be saying this stuff when there's zero evidence for it.
No, I know that.
I think there's zero credibility of anybody who was a high-level appointee in the Trump administration.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Any issue.
I mean, that panel was just an engineered attack, right? There's just no, you want to have both sides, right? But there was one side. It's crazy.
This whole both sides thing is really annoying when there aren't two sides.
That's right.
Nature has infinite sides.
I mean, this went on for decades with climate change. Oh, we have to cover both sides. Right. I mean, I'm in the news industry and I see this. I'm like, no, you don't cover the completely insane side because that's not a side.
Agreed.
False equivalence.
Yeah, false equivalence is exactly the problem.
Yeah, creationist theory falls right into the middle of it.
Right, yes.